As always, raise your hand. A microphone will be brought to you if you indicate who you are and the organisation that you represent and who you wish to direct your question to. Thank you.
My name is Peter Riesler. With a last name like that, you could probably work out I do actually hold 2 passports. I'd like to direct my question to all the senators. Over the last decade or so, we've seen a dramatic encroachment on our civil rights, and as a holder of 2 passports, who will look after my civil rights?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. You're right that there is an ongoing evolution in relation to national security legislation. It's something that's happened under governments of both persuasions. It has, on the whole, been a bipartisan approach. You're right, we do need to be ever mindful of individual liberties, but in this area, it's always a balance between the rights of the community as a whole to be safer, and the rights of individuals not to be transgressed. That's the balancing act that we have. That's where parliamentary scrutiny is important. That's where the joint House-Senate Committee on Intelligence plays a very important role. It has representatives from both sides. I think, to date, whether it be under the previous government or this government, we've got the balance about right.
Well, I don't have a lot to say on a bill I haven't seen, although we've had a lot of discussion out of the Cabinet about it. There is always a matter not only of a balance between civil liberties and security concerns, but also in the context of this, the constitutionality of legislation that's presented to the Parliament. So we'll take a responsible approach as we've sought to do. I would echo Nick's comments, though. I think the Prime Minister's rhetoric last week really put pay to any assertion by a government minister, and I'm sorry to do this to Mitch, but that the government was seeking to be bipartisan and sensible about it.
Well, in 2009, Malcolm Turnbull lost the leadership of the Liberal Party primarily because a Treasury official lied to the Senate, and that's an established fact. So the question is, should anyone lose their citizenship if a public official is going to lie, as they have done in the past? And should they lose their citizenship if they can't correct that mistake or that lie? That's what the debate's all about. Not whether they should lose their citizenship if they're guilty, but whether should they lose their citizenship without even knowing what the facts are and having a right to defend themselves. I just want to say, in my electorate office, I've had a couple of people who have had their benefits stopped in Social Security unfairly. And when I've investigated it, I found out the reason they were stopped because they had the same name as 2 people, one in Victoria and one in New South Wales, so that they were affected by the system. So we know the bureaucracy can make mistakes. I've got no confidence in the bureaucracy not to make a mistake at some time in the future. And the question is, if they do make a mistake, should you or any Australian have to suffer for it?
Last week, I don't think it's Mike. Thank you. It's very nice of you. Last week, we had the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, and that's about the rule of law, having a check on the executive of government. But of course, in terms of what we've seen with anti-terror laws, of course we need to keep Australians safe. But if anything, my criticism of Mark Dreyfus and the opposition is that Section 35P, which was passed in terms of our anti-terror laws, makes it an offence for journalists to report on a special intelligence operation, even though it may well be in the public interest to do so if the operation was botched and if there are issues in respect of that operation that are in the public interest for the public to know about. I think that's an issue that concerns me. And in terms of the metadata legislation, which was also passed, I wish that we saw, and I moved these amendments, but they weren't successful, the sort of safeguards they have in the United States, where there is an oversight, where there are some checks and balances before a journalist's metadata and a news organisation's metadata is obtained, because I do not want that legislation to have the chilling effect I suspect it will have in relation to journalists doing their job and dealing with whistleblowers, because such is the broad reach of metadata laws. So in terms of your concerns about dual citizenship, you know under the Constitution you can't run for Parliament. You'll have to revoke your other citizenship if you want to run for federal Parliament. He's what? It's okay. He doesn't want to run for Parliament. He's a very wise man. So the issue is this. Let's see what the legislation says. I think the sort of talk last week where Mark Dreyfus was attacked was really quite irresponsible, and I think we need to shift it not from a debate not just about due process, but will stripping citizenship of someone fighting for a terrorist organisation overseas actually make Australians safer, because they may not be on our soil, but they could wreak havoc somewhere else. I'd rather they be under lock and key here.
Thank you. Other questions? I have one then, exercising my prerogative. More so to our guests at the end here. The electoral system in Australia over the last several years has seen substantial change, and everybody's made reference to the fact that minor parties, micro parties, have now had the opportunity to see people elected to, in the Australian case, to the Senate. This has triggered some argument about whether or not somebody who gets 0.22% of a vote somewhere, but through preference wrangling, suddenly ends up as being an elected representative. And did the people of Australia really vote that way? I just, in the light of the comments that you've both made, do you have a broad comment about, and particularly, Nick, since you sat on the Electoral Reform Committee and oversaw some of the recommendations that came from that, do you have a view as to how the question of democracy can be entrenched, but at the same time, what would appear to be the people's will is also seen to result in people being elected in the way that people actually voted for them? Clive, please.
Well, the question really is, does anyone have the right to interpret, you or me, what the people's will is? Because we don't know. That's supposition. And the way information's controlled in Australia, it's really limited. We've got a lot of propaganda from a centralised media organisation. Democracy means about people expressing their will in the ballot box and how they vote. And our elections are really on how people vote. A large number, the majority of Australians, may not like the fact that there are minor parties, but that doesn't mean they should squash them. That doesn't mean they should make it mathematically impossible for them to be elected. And they all go to one example of one person that was elected with 0.5% of the vote. The rest of them weren't. My party got 5.6% of the vote. I got 50.3% of the vote in my elected. Well, D.O. Wang got 5.6% in Western Australia. At the second Senate election, he got 12.8%, right? So should we have a system where people like that can't be elected? Should we interfere with the system? Do we shoot the umpire at the end of the... Oh, I'd like to shoot the umpire at the end of the state of Orange, but do we? You know, we don't. We're a fair country, and we believe in a fair go. If we lose, and if we've seen the Labor vote decline in recent years, we've seen the Liberal vote decline in recent years. So what the Liberal Party and the Labor Party should be doing is coming up with policies that will allow them to attract that support again, not trying to fix the system and squeeze other people out from participating, because that's not what democracy is about. And what's more important than me getting re-elected, Penny, or anyone here being re-elected, is democracy in this country and the long-term future of the nation. We don't want to go to a one-party system or a rigged system where only two parties can cooperate, because the balance of ideas is what's more important to this country. Diversity affects those ideas, but you don't want to interfere with the people's will.
Just before Nick comments, I think Penny and the Minister have to get back on duty pretty quickly. So just a passing comment.
Just,
I think.
Well, I think I really addressed it in my speech. You know, the reality is, regardless of your partisan views, a number of million of Australians voted for non-major parties. Second, I think there are very significant recommendations in the JSCAM which really require a lot of consideration, because I think, as that committee pointed out, and I know Nick's comments today, these would be the largest changes in many years, and they're not changes that we should be rushing to.
Thanks, Stephen. And I just add, I don't think anyone is reflecting on the individual minor party senators who were elected at the last election. They were elected according to the rules. Whether people like the rules or not is a separate matter, but they were elected according to the rules as they were. As a matter of good practice, I think it's appropriate that the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters reviews the conduct of each election. We as a government haven't taken a decision as to what our response to that report will be. But I just come back to the 2 points. The senators, one, according to the rules, and it's good practice to examine elections after they've been held, and we will carefully consider the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee.
And of course my colleagues won according to the rules, but the rules need to be changed because this is about a voter putting number one above the on the box for the Greens and finds that their preferences go to the climate sceptics ahead of people that actually support action on climate change. Getting rid of preference whispering is as easy as 1, 2, 3. Allowing people, requiring people to vote 1 to a minimum of 3 above the line, as many more above across the line in terms of the group, in terms of the party groups or the individuals running, or below the line at least 12. I think that would actually put the power back into the voters and away from the backroom preference deals that are done as a matter of course. I think there is real scope for reform.
Right of reply?
Well, well, I would say that that's not right, really. We have 12 senators being elected at a double dissolution, or we have 6 in a normal election. So why would you cut the party choice off at 3? That's for one thing. But secondly, why do we have to cut off anyone's choices at all? Really, why can't everyone decide? Everyone knows in Australia when you vote by preferences, and you've got the option, if you wanted to vote for individuals below the line, any preferences you want to choose. You should have that opportunity, and you can vote for the party above the line if you want it. What's wrong with that?
Except that it could be argued that the Australian public don't know that there's a preference wrangler or there's a group of deals being done amongst micro parties out there that ultimately will see somebody with a low vote get elected.
Well, that's not true because there is a group voting ticket. It goes on the AEC website and it shows them exactly who they're voting for at that time,
please.
right? And
Ask anyone here. Have they been on the AEC?
Yeah, not only that, it's also up in polling booths, Steve.
Well,
I
seriously,
remember it well.
Do you look at all the, I mean, you would have known, but seriously?
I looked at yours, Nick. I looked at yours and I thought you'd put us down the bottom. I thought, this is a bad guy.
Yeah.
That's right. This is a really bad guy to put us so low down the bottom.
At least the feeling's mutual.
I like him. He's a nice guy. I love his haircut.
And I don't dye my hair. You can apologise for saying I dye my hair.
You don't dye his hair. He doesn't. I guarantee I withdraw that unreservedly. Yeah?
Thank you.
I don't dye mine, unfortunately. You know, so.
Look, group, I think there is scope for reform. I think the Labor Party is nervous about these changes because I think they're actually nervous about having optional preferential voting in the lower house, which they see would be very disadvantageous to them. So that may be part of the rationale for their reluctance to go along with this. But I think that people, you know, the group voting tickets, most Australians, when they're voting, don't understand where the preferences go. So maybe it's a question of greater education. But at this stage, I'm not optimistic that there will be a sensible reform. I think we'll probably have the status quo.
Yeah, but the other thing I'd just like to say, if I can, Steve, is that this is really a minor issue. The major issue is about the country and the economy and what we're doing. We don't want to just focus and change the system every time. We want to focus on how we can get more jobs, more economic growth. That's what your committee wants to look at. That's what is important work we need to do. You know? Making Australia a better country for all of us, creating more economic wealth in Australia. That's what we should be doing, I think. This is just a distraction.
I have time for one final question. Anyone besides me? Otherwise we'll be here all afternoon. Thank you. Great.
Aaron Rollins from the National Australia Bank. Question for you, Mr Palmer, but also welcome Senator Xenophon's views on this. You bemoan the quality, really, of some of your peers in the House, yet you're talking about lowering superannuation for those members, and presumably for the APS as well, given your views. The defined benefit scheme has already been, was ended a number of years ago. So really, what is your proposal to increase the quality of people being elected into public life? And how can that be made more attractive for those who are interested, particularly from those in the business community?
Well, I think if we look at the United States or some other countries, we see that public service is a very important thing. And you've got a lot of important people in the United States that have been heads of larger companies or corporations or public service bodies that work for $1 in Washington heading up various departments. I think that's a very amicable situation. In Australia, most of our heads of departments come from the departments themselves. They may have started 40 or 50 years ago, in the department and work their way to the top. So I think we need to have that interaction with the community, and the emphasis should be on public service. About superannuation, I asked the question and suggested that the entitlement age for superannuation for politicians should be the same as the entitlement age for the pension, but that wasn't received very well by members of the House. I thought it was the quickest way we could get the pension age down to 39. But anyway, that didn't work. So 35, he wants 35. Yeah, some have been that young. But I mean, the emphasis should be about serving our country, not how much money we get. I mean, I personally, because I can afford to do it, donate my salary to charity, because I don't believe you should be paid if you can afford to serve the people of Australia. You shouldn't be paid for it. You know, it's a real privilege and honour. And just like I don't think people should be career politicians, I think they should come in for 1 or 2 terms, and you know, once you've given your ideas, made your contribution, you should get back on with normal life. And I think what we have is a lot of politicians on all sides of politics that get elected when they're 23 or 24, they're still here when they're 45, they're trapped, they can't go out to another career, so they've got to stay here, so they've got to follow the party structure along. I think we need to have a law that just says that, you know, 2 terms is enough for anybody, regardless of who you are.
Can I just go to the issue of super? The defined benefit scheme doesn't apply for anyone elected after 2000, from the 2004 election. That was one of Mark Latham's rare victories. I'm sure there are many of his colleagues cursing him for that. But I think that in terms of the question of how do you get the best people to the job, one is issues of salary. I know that in Singapore, I think their cabinet ministers are paid a lot more than our cabinet ministers, and their prime ministers paid much more than our prime minister. I think there's some merit in that. But there's also a more radical proposal, whether you have a hybrid system in terms of the US, where the executive, the minister, the cabinet secretaries, the ministers in effect, are appointed by the president directly. Whether you could constitutionally have a system, and it would probably require a constitutional amendment, whether you would have some ministers appointed from outside the parliament, but they would still be subject to scrutiny through a parliamentary committee process or a question time. Now, that would involve a constitutional amendment, but that's the sort of debate that we need to have, because if we don't start talking about it, it'll never happen. So I think we do need a more radical change in the way that you can pick the best of the best on a non-partisan basis to serve the ministry. But given the history of constitutional reform in this country, it'll be a long time coming, and it would need bipartisan support.
I think there's a few people in this room that put their hand up for that, Nick, to be honest, and would be very successful at doing so. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please thank our 2 guests for their honesty. And we wish them every success in their respective houses over the coming, 2 terms in Clive's case, and yeah, I know what you got to go. That's all right. Yeah. Thanks very much, gentlemen.